We're here today to announce the first synthetic cell, a cell made by starting with the digital code in the computer, building the chromosome from 4 bottles of chemicals, assembling that chromosome in yeast, transplanting it into a recipient bacterial cell, and transforming that cell into a new bacterial species. So this is the first self-replicating species that we've had on the planet whose parent is a computer. It also is the first species to have its own website encoded in its genetic code. But we'll talk more about the watermarks in a minute.
Hi, Rational Muscle here. That was a short excerpt from Dr. Craig Venter's announcement last week regarding the creation of the first, or at least the most complete and complex, self-replicating life form. For years now, creationists and intelligent design proponents have insisted that their God speaks to humanity through the quote-unquote unmistakable beauty and design of creation. Well, for this video, we're going to be looking at one of many assertions along this line of reasoning, the idea that DNA is a code, and that within this code we can see the fingerprints of God. Yet, as I will argue, man has recently one-upped God, if indeed DNA is a message from the designer of the universe, and he has significantly done it at that. Stephen C. Meyer, the author of Signature in the Cell and co-founder of the Discovery Institute, a Seattle-based organization devoted to the idea of intelligent design being taught in schools as a scientific alternative to evolution, authored his 2009 book, all 600-plus pages of it, in the attempt to persuade the reader into accepting one proposition, that DNA is a code, and that since no code known to man has been formed without intelligence, DNA must have been created by an agency of intelligence. And in case you're wondering, and despite Meyer's coy responses to inquiries pertaining to this assertion, his agency of intelligence is Yahweh, the Christian God. Without going into an all-out ad hominem attack, which would be all too easy with the likes of Meyer, I do feel it's important to point out a few personal facts about the man making these claims, not to prove the claims are false, but rather to illustrate the lengths that ID proponents will go to in order to proselytize and advance their agenda. Meyer, despite being one of the founders of the intelligent design movement and the Discovery Institute, failed to testify in the infamous Dover trial. A link to that trial and the outcome is found below. Now, while there are numerous reasons that have been given, the most probable explanation, and one that was brought to light during the trial itself, is the fact that Meyer would have had to admit his religious bias for publishing his quote-unquote theory and pushing it on the public. While creationists have no problem with honesty in this regard, ID proponents are practically covert when it comes to hiding their Christian God-science connection, as the revelation of this truth would turn ID into what it really is, a philosophical position, a religious position, not a scientific position. And such was the ruling in Dover. ID is nothing more than creationism with a slightly more scientific moniker. My own suspicion as to why Meyer failed to testify in Dover is a bit more curt. I don't believe that he wanted to perjure himself, and the thought of going head-to-head with the likes of evolutionary biologist Kenneth Miller, philosopher and co-contributor to the Vita Digital Organism Project Robert Pinnock, and factual witness Tammy Kitzmiller, whose testimony could have left him in serious legal problems, probably left him shaking in his boots as well. Meyer has also falsified documentation pertaining to peer-reviewed scientific papers purported to support intelligent design and/or not support the theory of evolution. His 2002 Teach the Controversy strategy, backed by President George Chimpy Bush, quote, included submission of an annotated bibliography of 44 peer-reviewed scientific articles that were said to raise significant challenges to the key tenets of what was referred to as Darwinian evolution. Well, fortunately for the truth seekers and the reasonable among us, the National Center for Science Education did not take such a claim lying down. In fact, they contacted the authors of the papers listed, and 26 scientists representing 34 of the papers responded, and not one of the authors considered that their research provided evidence against evolution. Did you hear that? Not one. This was a blatant and absolutely intentional lie on the part of Meyer and the Discovery Institute. And this is similar to Don Exodus 2's pursuit of the quote-unquote list of scientists rejecting evolution that was published by, guess who? The Discovery Institute. Don Exodus 2 doggedly pursued this list of 101 scientists that doubted evolution, quote unquote, and his total dismantling of this outright lie, again made by Meyer's Discovery Institute, can be seen by clicking on the link below if you're interested. Now, this did not stop Meyer from publishing his book Signature in the Cell, of course, as there are millions of hopeful believers out there who are not quite as up on the bullshit as actual scientists in the field of evolution. See here as Meyer attempts to defend himself against Dr. Peter Ward, a guy who actually knows what he's talking about, on this whole issue of a code or signature within the cell.
And then thirdly, the most interesting thing to me personally is the discovery of the reams and reams of digital code that's stored inside DNA and transmitted in RNA. And these are features that we think are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than a purely undirected process.
Peter, let me ask you, if you had to explain to your students what it is that Steve promotes, what it is that he supports, how would you describe this?
Dogma.
Meyer's flawed premise is in the muddy distinction between the word code and the word message. In reality, DNA is not a code if you define code as something that is translated from one mind to another. In Meyer's worldview, this would be the mind of God to the mind of man. Jeffrey Mark makes a wonderful distinction in his review of Meyer's book, which is found in its entirety in the link below. Mark says, "But what is a code? In order to bring this argument into the realm of science, we better have a solid definition of code. If code is a physical means used to transmit information from one mind to another mind, then DNA is not a code. Yet, if it's a physical means of duplicating data, then DNA is a code, but language isn't." See the problem? This guy is using wordplay. He's making up a definition of code and then trying to use it in the realm of science where his argument doesn't belong. In fact, he's leaving out the aspect of human observers. It appears that in his definition, a code is simply something that contains information. But does anything contain information? The letter H by itself contains no information, but in the context of a word, it has meaning to you and me, and I can use it to transmit information from my mind to your mind. What ID advocates state is that DNA is a code, yet in reality DNA is nothing more than a tool for the duplication of data. Now, before you think, aha, a tool must be designed, think again. A tree branch can be used as a tool without having been designed as a tool. Now, let's look at man's version of Genesis. We'll call it Genesis 2.0, the creation of the first synthetic, self-replicating new species of life. As if that wasn't impressive enough, Venter and his colleagues were clever enough to place within these reams of code, as Meyer would say, the actual website for the life form itself. Oh, and they managed to include all the names of the contributing scientists. The reason this is possible? One of the team members created what he called a fairly simple code, only this is a real code, with real meaning to real humans that cannot be distorted, that needs no screwy numerology to try to find some hidden message, and that conveniently resides in a section of the DNA that does not screw up the transmission of vital data. In short, Venter upped the ante on God when it came down to sending a message in DNA. Now consider the implications here. Had God wanted mankind to know him, surely he could have placed a succinct and, as Venter's message is, unmistakable message within our DNA. Now, many Christians will naturally argue this point, suggesting anything from this would remove the necessity of faith to God is mysterious. And why these arguments fail is simple. The question in our day is not, does Yahweh exist, at least from a world point of view, but rather, does any God exist? And if so, which one of the 1,000 gods is God? Now here's where a specific God could have made his or her specific nature clearly known to man. Knowing beforehand that the English-speaking world would crack the genome, the inclusion of the entire book of Genesis into our DNA would have been relatively easy for Yahweh. Or what about the first chapter of the Quran for Allah? Or the Rig Veda for Vishnu, and so on and so on. The question I'm asking any believer of any faith to honestly answer is this: why was your God far more vague, in fact utterly silent, in the one place his or her holy word could have never been corrupted or mistranslated over the ages, within our very DNA? While Meyer and people like him may draw ridiculous conclusions about DNA being some form of code, a theory world-renowned mathematician Jeffrey Shallot calls incoherent in places and wildly wrong in others, Venter's code will stand the test of time for as long as time exists, or at least as long as English-speaking people exist and happen to have a valid internet connection. Surely the God of the universe, the ultimate designer, could have signed his masterpiece with a signature that was a bit more legible.